And on the surface, the story is kind of humorous, but in the meaning, it's deep. And the story goes as such. There was a man that was walking in the woods, and he came across these family of bears that were fishing. And while he was walking, he stepped on a stick and made a sound, a loud noise. And the bears looked up when they saw him. They were hungry, so they started chasing after him. And the man turned around and started running. And in his running, he made a mistake by turning around and looking at the bears. And he tripped over a log. And the bears were right on top of him, getting ready to eat him. So he closed his eyes and he started praying. And he said, God, please let me be some God-fearing bears. And when he opened up his eyes as he was shaking, he looked up. And the bears were on their knees praying, Lord, thank you for this food we've been ready to receive. On the surface of that story is kind of humorous, but in the meaning of it is deep, meaning be careful what you ask for, you just might get it. And we as black people, we've been asking for over 400 years to give us some God-fearing beasts, so every time we open our eyes, they're going to eat us anyway. So we go every Sunday after Sunday, we've been praying, and my mom always told me the best prayer you can have is on feet. And so we had to move and keep praying as you're moving, and we're in this struggle all together. And I will tie that into a Professor Small who comes to us with a well background and credentials as well as our panelists, and I thank them for bringing their information tonight that for us to use in our think process as we're moving into this prayer/revolutionary movement. Professor Small comes to us, he was a lecturer at City College of New York Black Studies Department. He was a former president of the Eastern region of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. He's a former imam of the Muslim Mosque Incorporation founded by Malcolm X. And also he is currently a founder and current member of the board for the education of people of African ancestry. And without further ado, it's an honor and my pleasure to introduce to you Professor James Small.
Being in such an impossible position after having my sister and my brother lay out such a broad perspective covering everything, you got enough to study for the next year and that bit of information to study for the next year. And one of the things we've got to remember, we've got to study. And we've got to really be looking for answers. I'm going to try to find some little space that y'all might have missed that I could fit something in that might be useful. One of the things I wanted to start out dealing with very clearly so that we might understand when one asks, why do you go to college? And people usually say to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, to be an engineer, to be a teacher. And that's not why we go to college. That's not why we go to school. People say to get educated, to learn, to be enlightened. That's not why we go. We go for food, clothing, and shelter. And when we get real honest, we'll say food, clothing, and shelter is why we're doing this. Why we're having this meeting today has to do with food, clothing, shelter, and safety and security for our group. If you're doing this for reasons other than that, you have to quit. Because it doesn't make much sense to do it for any other reason other than for food, clothing, shelter, safety, and security. And any ethnic group, any nation state you see doing what they're doing is doing it for the purpose of food, clothing, shelter, safety, and security. And you can paint that any little pretty color you want, but that's what it's all about. All of the killing, all of the molestation, all of the drug dealing, all of the international marauding is about food, clothing, shelter, safety, and security for somebody. And we have to start making a decision what we are going to seriously do about food, clothing, shelter, safety, and security for our body. pursuing this idea of education for the purpose of providing in a systematic way food, clothing, shelter, safety, and security for ourselves and our group, then we'll be more clear on how to do that. But I want to read a couple of things from a book by Dr. Wade Nobles called Understanding the Black Family. And he advanced two ideas and two concepts. One of them is called scientific colonialism. And as he deals with this concept of scientific colonialism, he says there is three major examples of how colonialism works that we need to look at. One, it claims the right to access. Two, the removal of wealth. And three, the establishment of an external power base. And we know that the colonial force of Europe have claimed access not only to our land of Africa, but it claimed access to our bodies, both male and female. And the damage is here, which I'll talk about a little bit later, the psychological damage from the access to our body. We know they claim access to our information bank, the knowledge acquired from our history and the anthropological, archaeological, and historical researches. We know they've falsified the record such that we think, as you've been told, most of that information really comes out of their histology. We know that much of the knowledge that we now have access to in our community comes from outside of our community, having been processed by another community and then brought back into our community for ingestion. Dr. Asa Hilliard wanted to describe further why we could understand what scientific colonialism is by understanding what it does. We know it destroys, it distorts, it suppresses, it falsifies, it intentionally confuses. And I think when we realize that the level of sophistication we see in communications, we see in space, aviation, that same level of communication exists in terms of education or indoctrination. And my concept of education is very simple. What we're calling education, for the most part, what we get going to schools and universities is really training, and at best indoctrination. Education should come from the culture of the people, and that culture must be self-focused. And what I mean by self-focus is our notion of Afrocentricity. Afrocentricity really is seeing the world through the experience of the African eyes. Seeing the world through the experience of the African eyes. So if you're the rape victim, or you're the murder victim, don't act like the murderer or the rapist. If you conduct yourself like the murderer or rapist, then you're seeing the world through the wrong person's eyes. If you're the victim, see the world through the victim eyes. I don't mean find a comfortable place in victimization, but understand who the enemy is and what has to be done so that process will cease and desist. But you can't see that clearly unless you see the world through your experience. Dr. Nobles had another position he called transubstantiation, which is probably the most important part of his book on Understanding the Black Family. And he calls this his major theory. And transubstantiation means very simply that everybody in the world interpret the events and the experiences they're having to mean what they want it to mean based on an analysis of their history that led to this point. Transubstantiation occurs when another group tell you what your behavior and experience and events means to you, and you accept that as real. Now, we've been doing that for a long time, and that to me seems to be the main problem with the African consciousness. That much of what we interpret about ourselves, about our God, concept of God, our concept of nature, our concept of ourselves, seem to me to be the things that is, or at the point that must be corrected first, if we are going to be able to do all those other things we've been talking about. If you cannot have a clear sense of how valuable you are based on your having decided that, if you don't have a clear sense on what your relationship is to the rest of nature based on your having decided that, if you don't have a clear sense on what is whatever this is you call God in a context that you've decided upon, you're in real trouble. You're in real trouble. Right now, and I don't know whether I'm going to say this here, but I normally open up my discussion on things concerning religion, and it's kind of a difficult topic to deal with because people are so sensitive.
Deal with it.
But I usually say you cannot be an African and a Christian, Muslim, or Jew too. And I guess in my area, young brother would say is religion. You know, that's where I think I'm best. What I mean, and maybe this is the place I can make a contribution. If we can't define for ourselves, based on our experience, what and who we are, and based on that experience, what and who God is, and based on that experience, what the rest of nature means, then we are dead. And it's not really a fear tactic saying that by 2020 we will be gone. They're working well ahead of that schedule. I think the way it's working now, we can watch most of our people wiped off this planet by the end of this century. You may think that is impossible, but these people have the technology to kill 50 million black people in a weekend, and have already made the world accept you as violent, irresponsible, and dangerous. Killing you would not evoke very much sympathy at all. And if it did, it wouldn't be long-lasting. Look at what they've allowed to happen in Bosnia. And they look like them, and nobody's crying. If it happened to you, believe me, nobody would cry if it happened to us. And it's in the works to happen to us because we represent, then I'll go back to the question of religion. You have to understand what we represent. Even in our confused, ignorant state, we represent the only true threat to white supremacy. Yes. Nobody else desires an alternative way of life. Despite the fact that we've been sucked into his system, and we've been sucked in through our fear of death. And our fear of death has to do with our false notion of God and religion. So, let me see if I can go back and see. Dr. Wilson was talking about how we understand the world, talking about what an African worldview should be in order for us to educate ourselves. Well, we must look on the table. You know, when we go to study things, you look for materials. You say, I want to learn how to construct a family, and there must be some models. The models must be somewhere on the social table or the education table, on the practical table. There must be some family design someplace that you can imitate. When you want to design a community, there must be some family design, someplace or communities design you can imitate. When you want to design a city, a nation, there must be designed someplace. There must be blueprint. There's something that we're using. And one of the problems is that the designs we've been using have been primarily European. The degree to which the black family suffers trauma is the degree to which we imitate the European family, which has built-in trauma. You might think, well, they don't seem suffer like we do? No, because in having control of the state and having control of institutions, they're able to take care of much of their fallout. Us not having institutional control, even with less fallout, we are unable to care for them. So it appears that the damage is greater on us, but what we are seeing is simply the normal, what is normal for European male-female relationship, what is normal for European family structure, what is normal for European social interaction. It is not normal for us. And how can I determine whether this is normal for them and not normal for us? We look at their history. And from the very beginning of history, as they have recorded themselves, there has been a traumatic situation in the relationship between the male and female, between the family, between them and God, between them and nature. How can we determine whether it's normal for us? We've been failing at that test because we haven't had access to the information that would give us a look at ourselves before this moment. What I mean by that, sounding like a preacher. You know, as Dr. Wilson was saying, and my sister was saying, and others tell us we shouldn't study history, and we shouldn't be looking back in the past. And when you think about that really good, that's the stupidest statement anybody can make, because the only place you have to look is in the past. Think now, let's just stop and think for a minute how silly that statement is. Really silly it is. You can't deal with any data from the future. It hasn't happened yet. You can't deal with any data from the present. It's not completed yet. It's happening. So the only place, the only source of any information to discuss any subject is in the past. Right? Think about that way. Because we haven't been thinking about that way, because many of us thought that we could either dismiss the past, dismiss part of the past, and then take another. No, the only place where there is information to be studied is in what has happened already. Okay. And so what we've been doing, or what we've been forced into, is to look at someone else's past as though it was ours, and begin to behave out of that experience. And I think you've heard already, when we do that, we become our own enemy. Now let me take religion, because that'll hurt you most, and you'll think about it deeper. If you say, I'm a Christian, with no offense to anyone, because I understand why we are all the things we are. I'm no healthier probably than any one of you, psychologically or spiritually. But let me just take this, because I want to hit you where it makes you think the most. If you say, I'm a Christian, or I'm a Muslim, or I'm a Hebrew Israelite, you will use the Bible. The Bible, the Old Testament is used by the Hebrews and the Jews. The Old and the New Testament is used by the Christians. The Old and the New Testament and the revelation of Prophet Muhammad is used by the Muslims. Now, most Christians don't realize that Muslims also use the Old and the New Testament. That makes up the Quran. If you do that, then you have to accept that both the Old Testament and the New Testament and the revelations of Muhammad is a story or a series of biographies of one family. Check your book out. It's a series of biographies of one family and the clan or ethnic group that is spawned off of that one family. Now, there are other people in the world, they don't take a lot of people seriously. They're simply dealing with what happens with this one family. And what the story or the stories about the one family is about how this one family began to understand the nature of God and how it uses this or not use it, and what is the rewards or consequences of using or not using it on, and the impact of that on this family. In the process of studying these books and studying this one family having these experiences, and if you accept that as being your tradition, then you have to accept that family's role, as you have done, as primary in ruling over your society. especially when that family have declared itself, or where the rulers have declared themselves to be that family. And you've accepted that proposition as well. So if you accept that proposition, then you have to accept your role as perpetual slave. And includes how important that is, because we can look at this in any other area, but religion kind of gets just a little deeper. Even when people say, well, I'm not really Christian or Muslim no more, we know that we are. I am. And you are too. When we accept that, then we have to accept everything that goes along with that, including something like the curse of Ham. Right. To be a slave of his brothers for ever and ever and ever and ever. Or we can go into church and sing, "Go down, Moses, to Egypt land and tell old Pharaoh to let my people go, and Pharaoh in Egypt land is really you." And that's what Moses is really you with a bad habit of killing people. But the point is, like, what I'm trying to say is that someone else have got you in what Dr. Noble called a transubstantive error, where you have accepted another cultural group's giving meaning to the event and the experiences of your life, and you begin to make plans and analysis on your future based on someone else's interpreting for you what your behavior means to you. It seems so subtle the way it's all done. Today, we listen to rap music. I love rap music. Not what many rap musicians do with rap music. Because I think rap music have done more to save our youth of this generation than most of us adults have done. If you look at the statistics, young blacks are declining in drug use, while young whites are increasing in drug use. And much of that can be attributed to the strength and the identity that this rap hip-hop culture have given to these kids. But because we don't control the industry that deals with distribution of this music and that deals with controlling production of this music, our enemy also realized the value of it, and they've caught it now, and they are perverting it to the detriment of our kids. And so we have to take some responsibility. Again, transubstantiation coming to being, because they are now telling our youngsters who want to be writers what living in a certain community should mean to them. So go and express it. So if your woman have made you angry, she become a beef, not a sister in trouble. Right? Somebody is tutoring them on what will sell in the marketplace, and then convincing them that they're doing some analysis on ghetto living. Talk to the young rappers. Well, we're just trying to tell the truth about the reality of the situation. Most of us don't even live in quote-unquote ghettos. This thing is so weird and strange when you imagine there's probably only two groups in America that have more educated numbers, according to what they call educated, college graduated numbers, than us. That's the white Anglo-Saxon and the Irish. I know y'all thought I was going to say the Jews. The Jews may have more percentage than us, but not numbers. When you consider all of the black colleges in America, just the black ones, brimming over at the top year after year, no room for anybody else. All of the state colleges in the South are all black colleges too, brimming over at the top. And we're in every white college in America for the last 20 years. But they said, we're not getting educated. Somebody played the statistics. But they're right. We are being indoctrinated. We're not being educated. In order to get an education, you have got to have an African model in place. And one of the things, one of the biggest weaknesses we have when we discuss these things and when we put on the table what is to be discussed, and when we put on the table the models that we are to reference, there is never an African model there. There's reference to African models, but there's never an African model there. That is a major weakness. What I mean by an African model of philosophical perspective, an African model of family structure, an African model of the feminine function, an African model of the masculine function, an African model of statecraft, an African model of economic approaches. We have them all, but they're never placed on the table. If I went into a Chinese community and says, how many people in here follow or worship using a Chinese religious model? Most of the hands will go up. There will be Buddhists or some other traditional religion. If I went to the Japanese and said the same thing, there would be Shinto or some other traditional religion. If I went to the Indians and said the same thing, most of them would be practicing the traditional religion. If I say that in here, I doubt if I'd get more than 2 hands. Let me ask you, how many of you worship a traditional African religion? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's a revolution going on here. I ain't talking about renaming Christianity or Islam now, or Judaism as African religion, because neither of those 3 are. You're aware of that, right? That wasn't really a trick question. That was a straight-up question. I want to know who's into voodoo, Yoruba, Contemplate, Santeria, and even those are modified forms. But Congo, tell you why I asked that. What is a religion in the first place? The word itself means to reach back and connect to something. What is it that people are trying to reach back and connect to? They'll say God or the divine laws. What are the divine laws? Is man's understanding of the laws of nature. Examine any religion, examine any culture. What they're trying to do is understand how to live in nature. How can we live in such a relationship that food, clothing, shelter, safety, and security can be ours without causing any unnecessary or significant damage to the rest of nature? That's all we were talking about. That's all we're talking about now. Except there's a part of the human family, quote unquote, that's not talking about that. And that part is dominating the whole human community right now. Because we have been made afraid to die. And the reason you're afraid to die is because of your idea of death, God, and life to begin with. If you were in an African system of understanding, you would realize there's no such thing as death. Thus there'd be no reason to fear. You may say, well, you talk that stuff if you want, but we all want to die. Precisely. There's no way out of the world alive, and nobody knows when they're leaving. Something that has been so completely decided for you, why would you even think about it? It's worked out. That's the one thing that's worked out that you know for sure. And if you understand the African notion of life, that you cannot bring this to an end, nor can you give it a beginning, that the Africans saw everything in this context, that God is every and all things at once, and that all things that is conceivable, and if you can think of not conceiving of anything, that too is a part of this God, and that dealing with any part of it with the reverence due the whole is giving reverence to the whole. Y'all with me? Yes, sir. Then you'd understand the value then that would be placed on the human life. That the African notion of the value on the human life was the value you would have on God's life if it was in your hands. But this wasn't some Sunday, Friday, Thursday, Saturday, go to meeting notion. This was the center of the social order. And at the center of that was the feminine principle. That a woman was not somebody you could beat on, misuse sexually, leave with a baby, or any of the things that we do as we imitate the white slave masters. There's nothing that we do to you, sisters, that the slave masters didn't do to you, and that's our role model. We're just behaving like him. He got our mothers pregnant and left her in the quarters and went about his business. He took the little baby that came from that and he enslaved it and then got it pregnant. You watch our behavior. We are behaving exactly like the white male role models that have been the primary models for black males. We're not doing anything significantly different, except him having such control in the society, he can mask his behavior while exposing our behavior. You understand? But if we look at how Africa views itself in the context of religion, and this isn't beating down Christianity. I could take Christianity and work with it, but most of you can't because you haven't. I'll tell you a little thing about Christianity. Christianity started out as an African deal. It is actually, Christianity, Judaism, Islam are actually innovation on fragments from the periphery of African society. That's all they are. Innovation on fragments. But see, with Africa, when you talk about religion, you're not talking about religion. The African, what we call religion in Africa is the educational system. It's where you learn your ideas about your worldview. It is where you got your role modeling. It is where you got your values. It's where you got your ethics. It's where you got your morals. It's where you determine your relationships. It's where you learn the primary designs of the institutions you had to construct. Because the model for the African family is God's family. Important to understand. Here's how they did it. And it's so simple. So simple. You know, the notion of the mother and child is an African notion. We see it early in Egypt, yes? The European misunderstood and thought it was one woman, one guy, one child, and ran off with the Mary, Jesus baby. And understand, and we really need to understand it, that really they misunderstood. What the Africans were saying was that all women, given the feminine function in the universe, is the mother of what is called God by the minds of the humans who are trying to explain their reality to themselves. All men are born as the son of that woman. So that the notion of God and this child being God, the man is God, but there's something greater than God, your mother. The idea of revering the female such that she was symbolized in the total society as the mother of God itself, which then tells you what your behavior was to be towards her. And for the women, the male child is symbolized as yours, and yet God, which tells you how you should treat it. They were role models. And so we had to imitate that. Once we made it in the abstract, absolute form, then we needed to have an institution where we could see it function, and that's where you get Pharaoh and the Queen Mother, being the symbols of God on earth. But not as an individual, male or female. They were only the symbol of God when they were a family, operating in that oneness, in that unity, in that collective, cooperative manner. If you look at the Akan structure in West Africa, you will find that they have a figure like the Pharaoh, called an Asantehene. And on one side of the Asantehene, you've got the Queen Mother, and beside her, you've got the Chief Priestess. On the other side, you've got a linguist, and beside him, you've got the Chief Priest. And the function of the linguist is to make sure that the Asantehene, the king, follows the tradition laid down in history and culture. And And then the role of the priest is to make sure that the rituals, which were composed over time to evoke certain kinds of scientific whatever, was to make sure that you did not deviate from the way things are done so that you could get the maximum powers out of utilizing nature. On the other side was the Queen Mother, who could remove, the only one in the society that could attend to the removal of this great king, who gave authority to him when she sat on his throne, on her throne. Otherwise, his throne would just be a symbol of the power. If you look back in ancient Egypt, you see Isis wearing the chair as a hat, a headpiece, symbolizes that the woman creates the culture, the woman gives the value system, and the men implement it. We still do it today. You sisters pick the preachers and the deacons in these churches. Problem is, the ethical, moral principle and standards by which we used to pick, we no longer do. So you still follow an African structural form, but the substance, ethically and morally, is Eurocentric. So we pick people based on how much degree they got, or where the degree come from, or how they look, and so forth and so on, and not for the ethical, moral, principle behavior that they laid down as a history up to that point. You understand? And wind this now to my 5 minutes. What's significant now, we've got the notion philosophically of the cosmic family of God. You know, the mother, the father, the child. And then you now have got the Asatahini, or the pharaoh, and the queen mother, and the chief priestess, and the linguist, those who keep a balance. See, by keeping that history, keeping the continuity of history, so this man know out of what I came is what must be reflected in my behavior. And the way I function ethically and morally must be governed by tradition. And on the other side, where I came from, the women over there, the queen mother, must monitor my function. And then the chief priestess, who is the one that knows nature and knows what to do with nature to help keep a balance spiritually. So she's a physician, a pharmacologist, an herbologist, and many other of the science must be mastered by these people we call priests and priestesses. But they're representing a family of balance. And under them you have a regional leader that have the same 4 office. And under him you have a community leader or village leader with the same 4 office. And when you get down to the family and the village and the household, you've got the same 4 offices. You have a head of that household who is usually the eldest male. You have the eldest female carrying the role of the queen mother. Always in a household there is the fetish, they call it, or the root woman, or that one who has studied the herbs and the pharmacology of the community and could assist the family, because every family got their own peculiar little illness or whatever disease or allergy, and that person should know how to master that as well as what would generally affect that family. On the other side, you've got the uncles who keep the lineage straight, and then you've got the elder who's in charge of the rituals and other things. So what the Africans does is imitate the family of God from the most cosmic philosophical interpretation of it right down to the living room of the home. That's how their educational system educates. All the things we see, the drumming, the dancing, the masquerade, the mask, and other things, are the variables they use to teach different qualities and attributes that need to become a part of that personality so it can learn the technocracy and the mechanization necessary to master your ecology in a way that you can have it allow you to provide food, clothing, shelter, safety, and security for yourself. So I'm going to bring this to an end, but I want to just make one last little statement. It's called post-slavery trauma syndrome. That's how I would describe what is wrong. That this post-slavery trauma syndrome way of saying there is something that is collectively wrong with the Africans, especially in the Western Hemisphere, and particularly in the United States. And that there's something has to do with a part of the war we've been engaged in with the Europeans called slavery. And that the trauma that we were put through, you know, if someone gets robbed by a gun or stabbed or hit by a car or raped or beaten up by the police or is captured in some military conflict, they give them psychiatrists and drugs and treatments, and they talk about the trauma and the consequences of this trauma for years and years, impacting on this mind even after a short period of time, like a few weeks or a few days or a few hours. Now, 500 years of consistent trauma, not only to your biological system, to your emotional system, to your psychological system, to your spiritual system, to your cultural system, to your linguistic system, to your philosophical system, unending trauma, with no one yet till this day, except in these small little therapeutic sessions that we do, have anyone really dealt with what is necessary in terms of addressing the result of the trauma in some systematic way, accepting the proposition that immense damage have been done. And we have been surviving, I think, because of, I don't know what to call it, latent memory of what we are about. Because even when we give up completely, something inside of us fight back. And so we haven't really been completely destroyed. The last part is that when we begin to refer to African models, it's like looking in mirrors. You will see a true reflection of yourself. You will not see a reflection of yourself looking at Asiatic models or European models. But the African model will let you see how much of Africa is still with you, and most of Africa is still with you. But you don't recognize it. What education, true education, would do for us, it will allow us to identify those things African about ourselves. And once it allows us to identify those things and we can begin to define what they mean, we can begin to find out what use are these things. Everything out of our past is not going to be useful to us in the future. But we're not going to know what's going to be useful until we examine everything in our past. You understand? So a major stage in our education, in our re-education, and our countering of miseducation is to examine everything in our past. And understanding that that examination involves part of the healing process that must begin to occur as a result of the trauma caused by the process called slavery. And if we are not aware that we are in need of healing, and we continue to make the assumptions that we are well, we will get more sick. And we will cause more damage. And very easy, I'll end with my little parable about my little squirrel. There once was a little black squirrel jumping from tree to tree, having a ball. He just flew around everywhere. One day, some rabbits, some little white bunnies came along and saw this little black squirrel just as free as he can be flying from limb to limb up in his trees, decided they would take a rock out of envy, jealousy, and hatred and knock the little squirrel out the tree. Well, this little squirrel, who happened to be a Geechee since you picked it up in my time, wait, this little Geechee squirrel falls to the ground, unconscious, unaware of what occurred. When the squirrel wakes up, out of his mind, having lost his memory of being a squirrel and flying around these trees, these rabbits tell him, oh, you're just a rabbit, you just look funny. That's because you're not as good a rabbit as the rest of us, you see? And you're not as strong a rabbit as the rest of us. Be white rabbits. You're a little funny-looking black rabbit. So you walk behind us and nobody else will see you and they won't pay much attention to you. And we're going to use you, but you're a smart rabbit because you can open those nuts with your teeth, and you can help us fill our coffers. You just keep cracking nuts, and we'll just say, you're a good rabbit. And they worked the poor little squirrel, and they got all the food they wanted, and it was time for hunting season to occur. They knew when the hunter was coming, so when the hunter started in, the rabbits head for their burrow through the briars. But God had prepared the rabbits with nice thick skins and nice thick fur, so the briars didn't bother them. This little squirrel said, well, I'm a rabbit. They said, that's a hunter, that's my hole, let me run too. And he ran, but the briars caught him. Because the squirrel had real frizzy little hair and real thin skin. So he got hooked up on the briars. So the hunter was able to pick the little squirrel up and bop it over the head and had dinner, little black squirrel. You see, the problem was the squirrel had been confused by this rabbit to think that it was based on some phenotypical likeness, the same. But we're not the same. If we were the same, we would not be holding this conversation.
An opportunity, at least maximize the opportunity for dialogue with our speakers. What we're going to do at this point, we will take 2 questions from each of our panels, and then we'll go 2 questions from the floor. Then we will open up the floor for any question to any speaker about anything that they have said this evening. That way we can have an open forum because of many diverse views, but yet complementary views have been presented, and you have a need to communicate with our speakers. So we'll do that at the time. We'll start with the students, then with the African American think tank. So it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 2 questions coming from the floor, and after which time the floor will be completely open for any questions, any speaker for the evening. Lincoln High School.
I was advised that because of the problem that
Dr. Jeffrey had in getting here in terms of a flight problem, that he will not be able to get here in time to speak. However,